Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to the Department of Economics webinar. We have some attendees already joined in, and we like to give a grace to those who are probably just joining us now at 2 o'clock. So we're just going to give them a few more minutes to just make sure that they are also part of this discussion. Okay, as we wait, let me just introduce myself. So my name is Asanda Fodoyi. I am an economics lecturer in the Department of Economics. And our speaker for today is Professor Charles Wait. He is an Emeritus Professor in the department. I'm not going to read his profile or bio because we've all seen it in the poster, and we can all agree from his credentials that he is the best person to give today's talk. So basically, Prof will be looking into the linkages between the recovery plan that was presented by the President, as well as the budget speech that was presented by the Minister last week. So we know that we are at the mercy of technology as well as data prices. So our session for today is set for an hour. We are going to have a question and answer session after Prof has presented his lecture. So as he speaks, you can make use of the question and answer tab on your panel. So it's got two speech bubbles as well as a question mark. So if something comes up, just drop your question there and it will be handled during this question and answer session. So it's 2 minutes past 2. I think maybe I can hand over to Prof so that we can start. So I think.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. From my side, also welcome at this webinar. We find ourselves in a situation this afternoon that reminds me of the unusual result of a Durban July horse race quite some years ago, when two horses tied for the first place. This was great news on the radio before the days of TV. In the evening papers of that Saturday, the Sunday morning papers, and even the Monday morning papers. There was, however, the sport journalist who worked for the paper that appeared only on Monday afternoon. Now you can understand his dilemma. What can he still write that has not yet been written? He made a plan. He converted the length of the track into the measurements of those days, namely inches. And then he wrote, can you imagine, over that many inches, there was not an inch difference between the two horses. We have now had the prelude to the President's speech, then the speech by him and the evaluations of it, and those were followed by the same sequence of events with regards to the medium-term budget policy statement by the Minister of Finance. Now, I will refer to the President's speech by an acronym, RRP, which stands for Reconstruction and Recovery Plan, and I will refer to the Minister of Finance's speech as the policy statement. I may just add that traditionally, the medium-term budget policy statement should not be referred to as a budget or a mini budget, because that's not what it is. It is a policy statement The one thing that normally is missing, that makes it not a budget, is the fact that there are no tax proposals in this policy statement. It all revolves around expenditure proposals, and consequently a document is also submitted by the minister referred to as the medium-term expenditure framework. Now, I think it is safe to say that we can capture both presentations, that by the President and by the Minister, in two variables. Two variables in this slide, namely the ratio between gross public debt and gross domestic product. The RRP is focused on a variety of measures towards stimulating growth in the gross domestic product, whereas the policy statement must obviously provide the resources for those plans of the President. But in this particular policy statement, we also find a tremendous amount of attention being given to the public debt situation. Now, the RRP is aimed at 5 objectives, of which the President placed the creation of jobs at the center. In other words, an objective which is directly related to growth of the gross domestic product. There you can see the 5 objectives, and as I said, job creation right at the top, and I'm not going to read all of those, but there are 5 of them, and you will notice the last one amongst the 5 objectives: improve the capability of the state. That is one to which I will also return towards the end of this presentation. So I think we can safely say that it takes no stretch of the imagination to see how the objectives and the priority interventions, when successful, and I want to underline when successful, all ought to benefit the gross domestic product. May I add, here is already room for an important link to the policy statement by the Minister of Finance on a bit of a technical matter, namely the size of the fiscal multiplier. But towards the end of the presentation, we'll come back to this concept, the fiscal multiplier. The plan is not discarding the significance of it being funded. In a few sentences, of which I shall quote 2, the plan touches on the variable public debt in our ratio above. Those 2 sentences are these ones, where the President said that all these actions will be taken within a supportive macroeconomic framework which balances the need to restore fiscal sustainability with economic growth. Now, many of you will be aware of the debate about the relationship between the size of the public debt and economic growth. We're not going into that at this stage. And then the President's second statement, where he says that this framework will provide a path of fiscal consolidation, debt reduction, and prioritization that is supportive of growth and recovery. You can see that 2 important concepts are underlined or emphasized here, namely fiscal sustainability and fiscal consolidation. If I can very briefly screen what those terminologies refer to, fiscal sustainability is directly related to our public debt variable. It refers to the government's outlook over the medium and long term to service its debt. I want you to notice that fiscal sustainability has got to do with an outlook. with a view to the future. And then on a technical note, quantitative note, it is supported quantitatively by calculating the government's so-called fiscal solvency. Now, this fiscal solvency, in short, compares the present value of anticipated future revenue with the value of outstanding debt plus the present value of anticipated future expenditure. And what I would like you to note here is that if we look at what sort of data goes into calculating the fiscal solvency, then the only one with a fair amount of certainty is the value of outstanding debt. And even in the case of the foreign debt component, that one is, of course, at the time when you make this calculation, that one remains subject to exchange rate changes in future. Fiscal consolidation is more of a process and a flow approach. It refers to strategies. Strategies that can be followed to reduce government expenditure, increase government revenue, or to achieve both simultaneously. That would be the ideal. Fiscal consolidation, when it is successful, assists at least one of the 4 objectives of public debt management, namely to reduce the cost of the debt to the fiscus. Fiscal public debt management, it's got those 4 objectives. It must be so managed that the cost of the public debt is minimized. Now, one way of doing that, of course, is to run up as little public debt as possible. The second one, macroeconomic stabilization, we all know that because of Keynesian economics. And then financial economics take us to the third one. And finally, public economics. And what we are talking about this afternoon takes us to the last one, namely to maintain the fiscal credibility of the fiscus. Now, an assessment of the plan, the RRP, and of the policy statement, we can't do that really and solely base it on the 2 variables in the ratio, and then further on concepts such as fiscal sustainability and fiscal consolidation. The bigger issue here is whether the plan and the policy statement can serve the 4 objectives of any economic system and what the success drivers are likely to be. These 4 objectives of the economic system are the following. Now, when you look at those 4, you'll probably recognize the first one as quite often only referred to as the efficiency objective. And in the last one referred to by several names like equity and fairness and social justice and distribution, etc., etc. And you may be reminded of the debate whether efficiency stands in the way of equity, whether equity stands in the way of efficiency. However, for South Africa, with our inequality problem, it's essential that efficiency and equity should support each other. But let us leave that debate for a moment. Textbooks in economics, most often on macroeconomics, discuss the objectives of macroeconomic policy. What I did to come down to these 4 objectives here is I converted those objectives which we find in macroeconomics textbooks with the aid of a 1973 publication by the late Professor Sampieter Blanche into the 4 objectives which I've listed there. Now, based on the academic calendar in South Africa, the allocation objective, efficiency objective for that matter, is usually brought home to first-year students at the kickoff by means of neoclassical marginal analysis, initially from a consumption perspective. My academic colleagues and those who studied economics, doesn't matter how many years ago, will remember the concept marginal analysis, a marginal utility and such things. Anyhow, those first years are still busy grasping this theory when the news of the day confronts them with a different way of allocating resources in a February budget speech by the Minister of Finance. So my question to my academic colleagues is this: when do we enlighten these future economists with the contrast between neoclassical allocation and the public economics approach to allocation? Now, in our presentation, the public economics perspective is at this moment performed for this afternoon's discussion by the policy statement. The policy statement is not responsible for the second element of that first objective, namely the efficient and effective application of allocated resources. There's work to be done after these two speeches, and that is to look after the efficient and effective application of the resources that are being dealt with in the policy statement. Now, we defined fiscal sustainability a little earlier on, but fiscal sustainability is only one element of a wider range of elements of sustainability. Economists most often use the word sustainability with regard to the growth of the GDP. Sustainability became part of the economics vocabulary because of the report of the Brundtland Commission of 1987, where we find this definition: sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Now, this particular definition is then quite often used in discussing environmental matters. In an article by Meerman and Andrews from the Economics Network, which was published in 2012, sustainable development is said to require sustainability in the 5 capitals of an economic system. And the 5 capitals which these people, these two authors list are the following. Natural capital, well known to us in economics as natural resources. Natural capital, which as far as sustainability is concerned, is meant to capture the environmental concerns. Now, in the RFP and in the policy statement, we did notice programs that are mentioned, such as working for water. I'm not dealing with all those, but it's just an example of the presence in the RRP and in the policy statement then of attention to natural capital. Then what our authors refer to as manufactured capital or physical or human-made capital. The RRP, if you remind yourself of the objectives and of the initiatives, supporting initiatives, the RRP emphasizes to a large extent infrastructure projects, of which there are many that are in dire need of maintenance, and let alone the need for new ones. So manufactured capital does enter the picture in our two documents. A financial capital, I didn't have to deal with that one in detail, except to say that together with the policy statement, the Minister of Finance tabled regulations about exchange control. So those will obviously have an effect upon the availability of foreign capital, or at least the flow of capital internationally. And then human capital, usually referred to in economics as labor, and in the policy statement, somewhat alarming, we find that for reasons or for a purpose which we will come back to later on, for a purpose we come back to, money is diverted from the two education departments. And then the last one on the list is perhaps not so prevalent in introductory economics textbooks, namely social capital. And what we can then, of course, add from our experience, apart from these capitals, sustainability, as we defined it earlier on, also applies to the fiscus. The fiscus has to be sustained. Now, I want to have a short word on social capital. It's a concept which is recognized in institutional economics, and we find one of the great proponents of institutional economics, Douglas North. He refers to a society's informal constraints, their conventions, their norms, their traditions, and their self-enforced codes of conduct. Those are relevant in our present context of searching for success drivers for the plan and for the policy statement. So we are coming back towards the end to this issue of what kind of social capital do we need to get these plans to work. Stability, from our list of objectives, are the well-known ones. I needn't have to elaborate on what areas in the economy we are looking for stability. At the present moment, as far as GDP is concerned, we are of course focused on the business cycle. Business cycle referring to the short term, and then linked to that, of course, in the longer term, we talk about economic growth. And what I must hasten to add is that stability in these different areas is supported by a stable political system, and if these areas are stable, it can make its contribution to a stable political situation. Then the fourth one of our objectives of an economic system, duty of an economic system for that matter, is what I said earlier on, comes to us in various names such as equity, fairness, distribution, and we can also add social justice. In which case, we want to achieve an equitable distribution of the pains and the fruits of economic endeavors, because the idea is to give people equitable access to earn income, accumulate wealth. The Constitution talks about the right to work, ensuring an equitable balance between responsibilities and rewards. That's what we are all looking at when we look at our paycheck, and we compare the paycheck to the responsibilities we carry, and sometimes we have a bit of a one-sided approach. If the responsibilities in our estimates are more than the paycheck, than the rewards, then we moan about it. If it's the other way around, we keep quiet. And then fairness, equity, social justice, of course, have got to do with what does the system do about persons who cannot and do not participate in remunerated economic activities. And there we think about the young at the pre-employment age, especially those who cannot be cared for by their parents or their legal guardians. We think about the old age persons, we think about disabled persons, and we think about unemployment. Now, in South Africa, we are aware of the inequality problem, and therefore we must attend to how the plan and the policy statement can contribute towards a more equal society. As a matter of fact, there is a group in South Africa that call themselves the Budget Justice Coalition, and they also published in these days, and they base an alternative policy statement on the clauses of the Constitution that guarantee human rights, and therefore, if you read their document, their emphasis is on this particular objective, namely equity, fairness, social justice, whatever you like to call it. Right, now we said that the RRP and the policy statement must eventually serve those four objectives, or help the economy to perform its functions in those four areas. So if we can then for a moment just go back to the slide which we had earlier on, and perhaps just fill in a little bit of detail here. These objectives and the priority interventions in the President's speech are together aimed at achieving a growth rate of at least 3% per annum for a decade. But when we read the policy statement, which is of course not written for a decade, it's only written for 3 consecutive fiscal years, the policy statement is based on the assumption that the economy will grow by 3.3% in the first year, and the minister admitted that it sounds much, but it is 3.3% from a low base. And then after that, for the other 2 years, with about 2%, with some minor decimals, which we needn't have to bother about. So you see that at least then for the first 3 years of the decade, the policy statement and the RRP don't match as far as growth rates are concerned. Now, that first objective in the RRP, job creation, that is where the President emphasized their plans, what he called aggressive infrastructure investment as a priority intervention number 1. And then the second priority intervention was expansion of the energy generation capacity. We all know about the problems we have in that regard. And then he mentioned mass public employment programs as a priority intervention 3. Then the second objective, reindustrialization. What has the President got in mind there? Now, there's quite a long list of things which he regards as steps towards reindustrialization. I am only going to mention 4 from the list. He foresees import replacement of 10% of the value of annual goods imported, and then he lists certain priority goods. He foresees export promotion of 2% of the rest of Africa's imports from outside the continent. In other words, his view is that we can capture 2% of the imports which African countries make from outside the continent. We can deliver them. He refers to government procurement plans. He refers to convincing the trade union investment companies to invest in companies that buy from local manufacturers. He talks about sectoral master plans that would encourage investment, productivity, competitiveness. Talks about various forms of assistance to manufacturing SMMEs. The Petroleum Resources Development Bill, which is supposed to be finalized so that more can be done in the field of oil processing and the development of gas reserves. And then one which appears quite regularly in budget speeches also, namely reforms to streamline regulatory red tape. As I said, it's not the first time that we hear about this one. And I would like to add a comment, namely that this one, reform or streamline the regulatory red tape, this one cannot be confined to the national departments only, because at municipal level, a lot needs to be done. Municipalities are the places where factories are built and factories are extended. And quite often we hear that the municipal regulations and the way in which applications are handled, that those are bottlenecks. So to carry out these things, we'll need to come down to earth to where these things are supposed to happen. And then the last one is a call by the President on our patriotism, namely to buy local. Now, when I heard that one, it reminded me of, I don't know if we are the only people guilty of that, but there's quite often a kind of an import bias. A product is better than the local one if it is imported, right or wrong. I want to give you the example of which I came across in Poland, where there are two brands of washing powder for automatic washing machines. Exactly the same formula, I was told, but the one package comes from Germany and the other package is made in Poland. And people prefer the German product simply because of an import bias. Where, as I said, it's exactly the same formula, but know what I mean. And then, of course, if we are called upon to buy local, it's a matter of how long will our patriotism withstand the law of comparative advantages. The President refers to an objective to combat crime and corruption, and for that purpose he mentioned rapid response teams, particularly on construction sites where construction sites are quite often disrupted by persons who are not happy with the fact that they aren't participating. And that was another issue on its own. And then the President also spoke about a new national anti-corruption strategy. Details were not given. The final objective of the President is to improve the capability of the state. And then he mentioned the rebuild of SARS. He mentioned to strengthen the Special Investigating Unit and other law enforcement agencies. And away from those, he spoke about the district development model, which is supposed to monitor projects at a district level. In other words, fairly close to what I referred to earlier on as municipalities. And he also gave us the assurance that he is appointing coordinating groups in the presidency that can oversee the projects which they have in mind. So that is what the president had in mind as far as objectives are concerned. We can move on to the policy statement by the Minister of Finance, and we can see where he placed the focus. As I said earlier on, the policy statement is in the first instance there to allocate resources, and in some cases reallocate resources according to what the RRP requires. And then the policy statement put a lot of emphasis on fiscal consolidation. As far as the RRP's first objective, namely job creation, is concerned, the policy statement names it presidential employment initiatives, and already in June in the supplementary budget allocated 19.6 billion rand to these presidential employment initiatives, and now indicated that 6.8 billion of that money will be applied to the extension of the social relief of the stress grant. In other words, it is redirected to the equity, social justice objective. And in the policy statement, there is a detailed table that shows the extent to which different departments share in the 12.6 billion, as well as the type of employment which is foreseen. What we don't find there are numbers which can indicate to us to what extent these plans will make a dent in our unemployment situation. That's not clear. But a question arises if we look at what is aimed at here with presidential employment initiatives and what is referred to in the policy statement with regard to the public sector wage bill, then we ask the question, are these positions permanently adding to the public sector wage bill? Because, as I said, this question is of significance because of what the policy statement is saying about reducing the wage bill in the public sector. But then there's one allocation in the policy statement that stands out like the proverbial sore thumb, and it is on the lips of all commentators. Now, I'm sure you have also already, you can guess what I'm referring to. It is the 10.5 billion to the rescue plan for the SAA, funded from cuts to the estimates for each of the 41 votes in the budget. There is a table that shows exactly how much each of those 41 votes, as they are called in the budget, but basically the different departments that are provided for in the budget. It indicates what each one has got to give up in favor of the 10.5 billion for the SAA. Now, more than eyebrows are lifted at this, what I call regressive redistribution, when it is noted that among the 41 votes are basic education, higher education and training, health, persons with disability, human settlements, and water and sanitation. Now, given the inequality problem in the country, ask yourself who benefits from the human settlements budget, to pick only one from the list I mentioned, and who benefits from a rescue of the SAA. We've got to make a value judgment here. We can also say, but what happened to the RRP's fourth objective, namely to fund crime and corruption prevention? If the police and the justice votes have to divert 1.39 billion to the SAA. Now, in all fairness towards the Minister and the National Treasury, we don't know when we read those documents where within each of those 41 votes, where that money will be taken away. Will it be taken away, say for argument's sake, in the case of police? Will it be taken away from their daily operational budget, their vehicles, their petrol, and that kind of thing? Or is it perhaps taken away in something that can be neglected for a year or two, something like commemorative parades, commemorative services, and that kind of thing? We don't know, but the fact is that because we don't know, we do ask questions. Now, the Minister of Public Enterprises defends this step by saying that in the case of liquidation, the cost to the National Treasury would be 18.5 billion and not 10.5. On the other hand, aviation experts and business rescue practitioners calculate that the airline is expected to have a cumulative loss of 59.7 billion between the financial years 2021 and 2025. So this I quote from a Daily Maverick report. It doesn't seem as if the Minister of Public Enterprises figured that in when he responded to the critique. Now we come to an important element in the policy statement, and that is the question of public debt. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just screening that list of facts which appear in the policy statement, and I'm not going to elaborate on each one of them. The fiscal consolidation envisaged here is meant to result in a primary surplus by 25-26, and that is 2 fiscal years later than what was foreseen in June 2020. And furthermore, that fiscal consolidation relies very heavily on containing the public wage bill. Now, here I want to add that the serious situation in which South Africa, together with many countries, find themselves with regard to the public debt is because economic doctrines in this regard that originated with Karl Dietschel in Germany in 1855 were largely ignored. Karl Dietschel's predecessors from Adam Smith justified deficit budgets on grounds of emergencies, and they usually referred to wars. Dietschel added that debt can also be used to establish what he called something of lasting utility, which we will call infrastructure. Now, that gave rise to Adolf Wagner's distinction in the 1870s between current and capital expenditure. We know that Keynes added demand management as a further justification. But even a great follower of Keynes, Alvin Hansen, admits that Keynes never paid real attention to the implications of the public debt. What is satisfying at the moment is we find that the National Treasury reports on spending reviews which they undertook since June 2020, and they refer to different things that they came across that are rather alarming. One is, of course, very pleased that they are doing these reviews, but I guess these reviews should have started perhaps in May 1994 already, and not only now that we are in a pickle. But I must hasten myself to ask the question, can the RRP and the policy statement succeed in achieving its objectives? Now, for that purpose, we have to go back to an earlier statement when we said that the economy must efficiently and effectively allocate resources and also apply resources. The RRP asked for allocation, the policy statement allocated resources, but both can only envisage, but they can't ensure efficient and effective application of resources. That's in the hands of those who are allocated these resources. The RRP at least acknowledges one condition for efficient and effective application, namely to improve the capability of the state. But I'm afraid amongst those 5 objectives, it's a matter of putting the cart before the horse. The proof of the pudding remains in the eating. What is it that we must eat to enjoy the pudding? In other words, to effectively apply these resources. I mention only, there's no time to go into detail about it. I mention the problem we have with a declining fiscal multiplier. Research by the Reserve Bank shows the reasons for that, shows the context in which we must see the role of a declining fiscal multiplier. I can only refer you to the Monetary Policy Review of October 2020, where this matter is set out in more detail. Then the policy statement further assumes that certain things will materialize. For instance, a positive outcome to be given to considerations to the number and size of departments, ministries, public entities. We heard this one before. It was undertaken by the president when he assumed office. I think we can add to what the policy statement lists also the size of the National Assembly, provincial legislatures, municipal councils, and we can ask a question on what is the value added by district municipalities. The policy statement undertakes no further recapitalization of state-owned enterprises. Well, we'll have to see. We heard that one before. The policy, or rather the public wage bill, and then I think what is important in South Africa from an equity point of view is where the policy statement refers to measures to strengthen the social protection system for the most vulnerable and a rethink of the structure of the human settlements delivery program. Now, these two, which have got to do with the equity, which have got to do with dealing with poverty, these last two issues listed here remind me of what George Stigler wrote in 1970, and it has not been refuted yet. He wrote, "The basic problem of poverty from the social point of view, however, is not the alleviation of current need, but equipping the people to become self-supporting." There is light in the tunnel. We do hear about a greater consensus reached at NETLAC between government, labor, and the private sector. In other words, we seem to be moving away from an adversarial relationship towards what Kaletsky calls a symbiotic relationship. That's excellent. And then very much earlier on, I referred to social capital. And the fourth objective of the RRP is to combat crime and corruption. Now, I would like to say that to do that requires an irrefutable condition amidst whatever the plans and the allocations are when we arrive at the application stage. Douglas North learned from David Hume, a Scottish philosopher at the time of Adam Smith. He learned from the Nobel Prize winner J.M. Buchanan when he referred to conventions, norms, traditions, and self-imposed codes of conduct. A return to what the broad South African society accepts as norms and codes of conduct is urgently required. And I would like to suggest that the Cabinet can do well to remember this when they approve of the Minister of Finance's plans to impose more taxation. Don't watch complacently as tax morality deteriorates further. Thank you.
Asanda, just unmute, please.
Sorry, my mic was muted. Thank you so much, Prof. That was very insightful and educational at the same time. We have now come to the question and answer session. So if you want to pose a question to Prof, please make use of the question and answer tab. So you will see it has two speech bubbles and a question mark. So as we wait for people to type their questions, I'll abuse the platform and I'll pose two questions to Prof. Wait. So Prof, as an academic, you have referred us to the objectives of public debt, the objectives of, an economic system, and also the forms of capital to be sustained. In your experience, having reviewed, a number of policies and trying to see whether they do follow or they do take these objectives into consideration, do you think that the policymakers actually have the luxury to refer to these objectives to see that their policies are in line with them? So that's the first question. And then the second question would be on having reviewed both the budget speech as well as the recovery plan, do you think that we still see a lack of policy coordination as far as government is concerned? So we'll take those two questions and then we'll just go to other questions that attendees have.
Your first question, do policymakers take these things into consideration? I would like to refer to a visit we had here a couple of years ago from two persons from the presidency, if I remember correctly. They were going around the country to the universities and they were talking about establishing a unit which can investigate what are the consequences of a particular policy proposal. In other words, their idea was to investigate proactively what are the likely consequences of a policy proposal. And they were laying particular emphasis on the sort of direct consequences and also the indirect, or let me even say the unwanted consequences of a policy proposal. Now, they've never been back. I'm not quite sure whether they established that unit, but we do hear regularly from the president about a monitoring unit in the presidency, and I want to hope that the National Treasury will definitely take these things into account. I'm sure they are very much aware of not only the direct consequences, but also the indirect consequences of whatever the policy proposals are. So that's my answer to your first question. And then the other one about coordination. Well, when the president speaks about economic reforms and removing red tape and delays and things of that kind, that of course is where this must come to the fore. The extent to which one department delays the activities of another one. And it can also possibly be improved if we have got less departments. We have, for instance, got a Department of Trade Industries and Competition, and we have got a Department of Small Business Development. Do we really need two? Won't we get better coordination between national industrialization policy, for instance, as it is formulated and administered in the Department of Trade and Industries and Competition, and as it then affects and applies to small business? Why must that then be handled by a different department? I think greater coordination if you combine the two into one.
Thank you so much. Now you've covered both questions. So I have other questions from the attendees. So there's one that's asking, does the Cabinet have an understanding of economic principles that must be adhered to for a success year on year? And then the second one is it relates to South Africa's macroeconomic recovery plan. So it says, my question is rather more centered around investment stimulation policies amid the constrained growth climate. I have noted that investment in infrastructure is widely being encouraged, but are there other useful investment stimulation policies that could possibly drive growth post-pandemic?
The first one about what goes on in Cabinet as far as economic principles are concerned. Well, I attended a webinar this morning, which was also a discussion of the budget policy statement, and there were grave concerns about the ideology which is driving a government, if you look at this SAA thing, for instance, it is coming such a long way already. I remember in the days of Mr. Trevor Manuel, a budget speech by him, where he said the SAA is again applying for a bailout, and he is now sick and tired. Those were his words. He's now sick and tired of the SAA, and he will give them this money this time, but that's the end of it. And now we know where we stand with the SAA. So it seems as if these things there must of course be a difference of opinion in the Cabinet, but it would appear as if sometimes these decisions are going the wrong way. as far as economic principles are concerned. And we mustn't forget that next year is an election year. The recovery plan, the person asked whether there is anything else but infrastructure. Now, I suppose it all depends what we regard as infrastructure. What I found in the documents referred to, although I've not seen the exact plans which the president referred to, but I've seen, for instance, that they count something like the public housing as infrastructure. Maybe one would think that the supply of water, electricity, sanitation, that is infrastructure. They add the construction of the houses. Really, it depends how wide we take the definition, or rather, not the definition, but the list of infrastructure projects. We know the situation on our roads that are deteriorating and Sunroll that can't keep up. The question is, should we not perhaps put more effort into restoring an efficient railway system? One of the problems with our infrastructure, the exporters tell you that the harbours are overloaded, particularly Durban. It's not so fast to get things, say, from Johannesburg to Durban and through the Durban port. If those things can come right, it must mean that our exporters can perform better. And that is an obvious case of infrastructure. What we can still add, that I'm not so sure of. We can perhaps, if we had the time, we can brainstorm a little bit of what else than infrastructure. Because infrastructure does go as far also as the SMMEs, particularly those that are in the construction industry, broadly defined construction industry. We know how important SMMEs are as employers, as generators of economic growth. So really, it's a matter of deciding what do we call infrastructure and what is not infrastructure.
Thank you, Prof. We have other questions. Let's take two. So this one is, it reads, with regards to the economic recovery plan, we have heard most of these proposed policies before, and they have not been implemented. So what should be done differently so that we can achieve these plans or the objectives of these plans? The next question says, thanks, Prof. Your presentation was brilliant. I just want to know what your views are on the economic growth rate of 1.7%, which is set by the Minister for 2022. So this is coming from our colleague, Vili, at George Campus. So let's take those two questions and then we'll have another round.
Yeah, the question about these plans, particularly the RRP, the question about putting them to practice is a very, very valid question. It is a question that applies not only to this plan, it applies to all of them from 1994. The RDP, GEAR, as Giza and all those. Many of these things are very beautifully formulated on paper, and on the ground very little happens. And I think one of the there may be two reasons. One reason is the capability of the state. And I'm not trying to run down any public servants, but the point is simply that the state must have the capacity to do what it wants to do. And we must bring that again down, not only to Pretoria or to Bishu or to Bloemfontein or whatever. We must bring it down to municipalities. And we have got all these municipalities. We regularly see reports on TV of how incapable they are of maintaining sewage systems, water systems, and that kind of thing. That's where the problem lies, with the people that have got to carry out the work. That's the one reason. The other reason is that for too long, there was an adversarial relationship between the public and the private sector. The public sector, particularly perhaps from the politicians' point of view, looked upon the private sector as their enemies, whereas the private sector has often got the capability to do the job. I don't want to identify this particular example too closely, but I know of a case a number of years ago where one of our provinces had to return a considerable amount of money to Pretoria that was meant for upgrading hospitals. And why it was returned to Pretoria was because that particular province just couldn't get tenders appointed, or contractors appointed rather. They just couldn't go through those steps involved in appointing tenders. And some of those contractors said it's the easiest thing in the world to do the job they want to have done, just award the tender. So the bringing to fruition of this thing has got a lot to do with the capability on the ground. 1.7% growth, that may be realistic from a very low base where we are. It's by no means enough to solve our problems. Population grows at a faster rate than 1.7%. In other words, the per capita growth is minimal. And all these things we spoke about this afternoon, the RRP and what the policy statement is trying to do, must uplift this percentage. That's about the only thing I can say.
Thank you, Prof. So we have 3 other questions. So this one is a bit long, so I'm just going to read it out. It relates to social capital. So the attendee says, we have been looking at World Values Survey data, which shows how inclination towards cheating on tax has been increasing over the years, even though in 1994, over 2/3 said it is never justifiable to cheat on tax. And by 2014, that had dropped to 1/3, meaning more and more people feel it is good and acceptable to cheat on tax. This is a blow on fiscal sustainability. Is the social capital angle being explored fully? Is there room for behavioral insight unit in the presidency office, e.g. in the Department of Monitoring and Evaluation? And then another question reads, could our budget actually work without the necessary political will from the executive?
Are those the two questions?
We have one more that I think we can also, answer in this round. So the last one says, afternoon, Prof. National Treasury bonds are now on junk status. How will this affect the implementation of the RRP going forward?
Yeah, okay. The first one about social capital, what I collected from what you read to me is this questioner, this person is referring to cheating on taxes. Now, the point is this, that there are legal ways of avoiding taxation. We talk about tax avoidance. That is when you follow the concessions which are allowed in the tax legislation. I don't think we doubt that. But then there is the other one, the serious one, is tax evasion. And that is where you are taking chances. Now, what seems to have happened, and to some extent these things are still in court, what seems to have happened is that the capability of SARS to track down on tax evasion, that capability suffered a lot as far as personnel, expertise, know-how, etc. Is concerned. So therefore, that kind of thing unfortunately happened. But there's no way in which we can morally justify tax evasion. But also not in a country like South Africa, where taxes are needed to support the vulnerable members of community. It's an absolute sin against vulnerable members of the community to cheat on taxes, in as much as it is a sin against them to be corrupt with COVID-19 allocations and that kind of thing, which are before the court. There's no way we can justify cheating on taxes, but the government has got a very, very serious task in this regard, or a duty in this regard, and that is to make sure that our tax money is wisely spent. Because the minute people see that our tax revenue is squandered, as we have had many examples before the Zondo Commission, that undermines tax morality, and with tax morality undermined, we move straight onto tax evasion. The political will, well, that's a topic which I wonder what the political scientists would like to say. It appears to me that so many of these undertakings that are repeated in one budget speech and one policy statement after the other, and which don't come off the ground, they certainly indicate a lack of political will to take the bull by the horns. And we're not going to get very far without that. And then the last question was about what is the effect of junk status on the RRP? Well, the one important thing which is mentioned in the policy statement is the cost of borrowing. There are figures in the policy statement, and there were figures also in June showing the number of percentage points by which interest charges to the government have gone up from early in the year until June, and they will probably find the same thing in the policy statement, because I can recall that in the policy statement, in some of the projections, the minister is indicating that he makes an allowance for an increase in the cost of borrowing. So insofar as the RRP, particularly the infrastructure projects, have to be funded by borrowed money, that borrowed money is going to cost us more. And I may just add, somebody has not asked the question, fortunately not for me. There are countries with very much higher debt to GDP ratios than we have got. How do they manage? They manage because their interest rates, which they are charged, their interest rates are lower, and their interest rates are lower because they have got better prospects with regard to their GDPs than we have got. We must remember that those interest rates are determined by a risk factor in the perceptions of the lenders. And that's where our RRP is going to cost us more when we borrow money.
Just unmute, Asanda.
Thank you very much, Prof. And thank you for taking our questions. We have come to the end of the session. We have run over time. Thank you for being patient with us. Please keep a lookout for our upcoming webinars, and if you have any questions that you would still like to pose to Prof after the session, you can send them through to my email address that was in the poster, and then I will forward them to him. So thank you very much. See you in our next webinar. Have a good afternoon.